Thanks so much for joining us today on Feelin' Good, sponsored by Warren County Community Services. I'm your host, Shelly Abrams, and today I am delighted that we were able to work into a very, very busy schedule of a very, very busy woman who is very involved in our Warren County community as well as statewide issues, and that person would be Shannon Jones. Thanks for joining us today, Shannon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Shannon, of course, serves as a Warren County Commissioner and also serves as the President and CEO of Groundwork Ohio, which I would like to start off our discussion with a little bit of background about you and how your journey has brought you now to Warren County Commission and Groundwork Ohio.
Sure. Well, I'm delighted to be here with you to share a little bit about the work that we're doing in the county and around the state. I suspect, I don't want to go that far back, but I'll go maybe 16, 17 years back when I started my service in the Ohio General Assembly. So I spent a couple of years in the Ohio House before being appointed to the Senate. And in that decade, I spent a lot of time really trying to understand why our health outcomes in the state are so poor. Why are our birth outcomes so poor in this state? How do we improve the lives of our families and our children? How do we better meet the needs of our aging population? So I've spent a lot of time in the General Assembly really doing a deep dive around education and health and getting myself familiarized with some of the policy levers that we could implement to try to improve things. And so that really kind of propelled me into a real passion for children and families and understanding why it was so smart for us to invest in young children in particular as a taxpayer, but also as being part of a community. So from there, from my service in the Senate, then I went to the County Commission a little over 6 years ago, and I continue to serve there. And even in my work in the County Commission, which is clearly different from the state legislature, I'm still really passionate about young children and the health of our communities. So I do a lot of that work as a commissioner on top of, the typical roads and sewers and culverts and budgeting things. And so when I moved to the commission, I also had the opportunity to take on this leadership role at Groundwork Ohio. And it was so consistent with my, love and passion that I really jumped at the chance to kind of bring these two worlds together of public policy, but also, how government can, use those levers to improve the lives of children and families. And so Groundwork is a statewide public policy and advocacy organization that focuses on that prenatal to age 5 period of time, which is some of the most critical years of development in a child's life. It sets the whole trajectory for lifelong learning and success. And so that brings us to today where, I continue to whether it's at the County Commission or at the National Association of Counties, where I chair their policy committee on human services and education, to really try to make the lives of people in our community better.
Well, let me ask you. I mean, that is such an impressive journey that you give us a little point of view on. Were you a political science major by any chance?
I actually wasn't. I was a communications major, but I always was really interested in, I'd say politics, but I think, looking back on it, politics was the word that I would use, but I was really interested in the policy, not the campaigning, but the deep understanding of the role that government plays to support its constituencies. And so that's really been the theme that has kind of followed my professional career for all these years.
Well, it's obviously a passion of yours to continue with the many avenues that I read about in the paper, which brings me to this article that was in the Sunday Journal News this week, and it actually has a picture of Shannon and quotes her in this article, and I thought, how timely that, here we are, we're going to talk. So the headline was Child Care Crisis Holds Back Children, Parents, and Economy. And this was the first article in a series. This was Sundays, then there was a follow-up on Monday, and then on Tuesday. So why don't you begin? I thought this was interesting as well. It says, issue has costly domino effect on families, workforce, and student success. Maybe explain to our audience what that is all about.
Sure. So when I started in the General Assembly, I almost hate to say this because it dates me, my kids were 2 and 7. So I was a working mom who was working out of town. Fortunately, I have a super supportive husband who helped make this work. But childcare was a big part of our lives, our kids' lives, our families' lives, and my ability to be able to provide for my own family. And so I remember those many years ago how expensive it was, how hard it was to find good quality childcare, and how for many years it felt like, because it was true, that you're basically working to pay for childcare. So you're trying to get ahead, you're trying to provide for your family, but the childcare is so costly. And that was a long time ago. And now we know that the cost of childcare has long outpaced inflation. I mean, prior to this high inflationary period of time, it has long outpaced inflation. And in fact, it was as expensive for most families for infant care, for example, as the cost is the same cost as the cost of 1 year childcare is 1 year at Ohio State University.
Oh my.
And so when you think about that as a young parent who had, that's who has young children typically, or young parents, they're at their sort of least amount of income. They're at the beginning of their careers, and they have no time to really save for childcare. They are merely they have a child, and then they need to find childcare. So it's a really tough situation. You add a global pandemic into the mix, and that has sort of put kerosene on top of an already challenging and expensive system. And that's where we find ourselves right now, is that even though childcare is really expensive, the pay for our childcare professionals is very, very low. And the rub is there's only so much that parents and families can afford to pay, but those systems are being built up on the backs of the professionals, the teachers, who are making in the state of Ohio on average $12 an hour. And most of them don't have any benefits at all, health care or other insurance, or retirement or anything. And so they do it because they love children and they want to take care of children. You add this inflationary period on top of it, and there's a massive teacher shortage in childcare. And providers are closing, and providers are closing classrooms because they can't find enough teachers. And the costs of childcare is going up, putting added burdens on families. And so what we've seen in Ohio is no different than what we're seeing around the country, which is you've had a lot of women in particular, though not exclusively women, leave the workforce. And they're leaving the workforce not because they want to, but they simply can't afford to work. And then juxtapose this with the fact that there's open jobs and all kinds of industries are saying, we need workers, we need workers. Well, what's happening is those workers, many of them are already trained workers, can't work because they have no place to put their children because childcare doesn't have workers. So the workforce behind the workforce is really starting to collapse.
Well, I know you mentioned that. This was a series of Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and I know you used that workforce behind the workforce quote in one of the articles, and I thought that is so true. That I actually asked a couple of my friends, one of whom had worked for Procter & Gamble. And I said, when you worked at Procter & Gamble, did Procter & Gamble offer childcare at the workplace? And he said he didn't recall they did in the 70s, but he thought that starting in the 80s that they had, and I don't know if they still do. But he said they actually had kind of a separate building that was in the complex area. And that made me think how many companies are able to do that, able to provide that, because that seems like that would be a very workable, option and benefit to offer workers. What do you find?
So there are some really large corporations, perhaps Procter & Gamble is one of those, that does have on-site childcare for their employees. And it's great for those employees. What I always think about is, 80% of the jobs that are created in this country are created by small businesses. So if you go down Broadway or Main Street and you see all these small businesses, none of those businesses who are all in need of workers can afford to build up childcare capacity for their employees, even if they want to. And so we really have to kind of look at it as a social good. If we want people to be working and we want them to be able to have the conditions to support their own family, we have to invest in a childcare infrastructure so that they can do that. The truth of the matter is when you think about the pandemic, what people began to realize, I think women always understood this by and large, but a lot of men didn't understand this because their primary role hasn't been taking care of the children, is that the K-12 system operates like childcare. Now, I'm not diminishing the educational function that happens in there, but you'll often see the second parent or the non-working parent going back to work or taking on a part-time job to make extra income for the family once the child gets in school. And so when all of those facilities are closed down, people are suddenly like, oh my gosh, how are people going to work? Like even the concept of work from home sounds great, but if you have a 9-month-old and a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, listen, if anybody could get any work done with young kids at home, God bless you. You are a better person than I. That is really hard, and it was really stressful. So it's just this reality that we now live in an economy that requires, in many cases, two parents to be working. Now, it's not true all the time, and for those families that have those choices, that's great. But there are a lot of families, the vast majority of them, where both parents work in order to provide for their children. There's also, a large portion of young families where there's a single parent head of household. And so, how do we provide the responsive, developmentally appropriate, nurturing caregiving that those kids need at their youngest and most vulnerable period of time, while at the same time those parents can be in the workforce, focused on that job for that period of time, to be able to earn a living to pay for that child's basic needs. I mean, that's just the reality that families of today, the economy of today, are having to grapple with.
So with those issues being stated, what types of solutions, or have you discovered solutions in maybe other countries, other states, where you've done some research? What are you finding is possibly working for a solution?
Yeah, so this is not a problem unique to Ohio, but it is definitely a national issue because, for years and years and years, we thought about school as starting in really first grade. A lot of school districts, especially around here, have kindergarten, but it is not a requirement in Ohio. And so when we have this concept of school, it's based on, 200 years ago, what the needs of children and families were. And so we think about school being at desks and chairs and having a child being able to sit still to be able to listen. The truth is that you have the science and research behind a child's ability to learn just so now outpace public policy. So what we know today is 90% of a person's brain is developed in the first 5 years of life.
Right.
And so what we didn't before recognize as education, we now understand that those, whether it's engaging with music or the types of reading and repetitive rhyming, the looking directly at each other's eyes and repeating sounds, that is not just play or baby talk.
Right.
It's literally brain building. The architecture of that child's brain is being built at such a rapid pace. And so now that we know that, we have to start adjusting our public policy to recognize that. So it's not to say that if a child has been in a really traumatic situation as a baby or a toddler, their parents experience poverty or homelessness or perhaps a divorce or drug abuse, their brain stops developing. And it doesn't mean that they can't learn once they get to school. But what it does mean is that they are less likely to start school ready to learn. Sometimes they're already 2 years behind their other peers. And no matter how great the kindergarten, first, second grade teacher is, the studies show and the data show that they never get caught back up. Rarely do they get caught back up. And so what that means is we're often paying for extra remediation as taxpayers. Some kids are held back, so we're paying for an extra year or more of school. Some of these kids end up dropping out of school and not graduating. Some of these kids end up interacting with the criminal justice system, which is really expensive. And so we know that kids who don't start kindergarten ready to learn are more likely to not be reading by 3rd grade with their peers, not be proficient in math by 8th grade, less likely to graduate. If they graduate, less likely to be connected into higher education. And their trajectory, we know that their earnings are substantially less than their peers. And that's, even taking into account that they don't end up in the juvenile justice system. And if they're in the juvenile justice system, they're more likely to be in the adult justice system when they become adults. So it's an expensive proposition the way we're operating it now. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at some other countries that have much more robust schooling, the thing they have in common is they're starting a lot younger. So, a lot of the Scandinavian countries have said, we value this. We pay our teachers a lot more, especially those teachers that are at the younger ages. We culturally think about teachers in the younger ages as babysitters. We don't think of them as teachers, but we know a highly trained teacher is going to be able to really help children develop and grow and nurture. And those who are maybe experiencing trauma or some instability in their family, they're going to get the kind of support they need from their teachers. It's a super important role that we've just not really valued in this country.
Well, it's so challenging for teachers, and I had a couple questions from early childhood, and as you know, and I know you're very involved with Warren County's community services, because again, Shannon's picture is on the front of this particular card. You were doing, I think, you were involved with maybe ride-alongs with Meals on Wheels.
Oh yes,
That's when this card was made up. But Lisa Kayard, who's in charge of early childhood education at Warren County Community Services, had a couple of questions which you've already covered, but she's already said that the idea of even behavioral issues with the children kind of catch up. And then, providing mental health services and that type of thing, which I've always been. I was an educator originally at the high school level, and I can remember in 1973 going before a local board of education that I didn't work for, but I encouraged them to consider mental health counselors, because at that time it was basically counselors, one in this building and maybe one in this building. And then I said, would you consider mental health counselors throughout the district on a full-time basis? And I know at that time they just didn't have it in the budget. And I kept saying, how important this is? Because you could tell. I could tell when I was teaching and looking out at my students, and I taught at the high school level, and just talking with them after class, because I taught home economics, vocational home economics, and we did home visits, or their parents would come in and we'd talk. And you knew that there were other things going on in their life, that here you are trying to teach them something that probably is very is this really important to them with everything else going on in their life? And wouldn't it be great if they could get a handle on how to deal with, just life in general and so forth. So I think that's why I've always been such an advocate. So I will say that I'm delighted to see more school districts investing in mental health counselors, mental health services in their buildings, in their systems that are there pretty much all the time. I mean, they're available to students. What do you say with regard to that issue?
Yeah, so there's no question there is a need. We have our suicide rate among teens is abysmal. It's a real public health crisis. The world is just so different. I mean, people's lives are a lot more complicated than when I was in school. And, I remember peer pressures and things, but it was so different when my kids were in school. Like the types of things that a lot of kids are having to handle now is just can be overwhelming. And so there's no question that there's a need. And I'm like you, I'm really glad that more and more districts, including and the state is funding a lot of mental health services in our K-12 schools. The thing that I would add to that, where I think we're still missing the boat here, and again, it's the same principle around the childcare that we talked about, where we think about learning happening in a school building. We don't understand that learning is really happening in this, birth to 5 period of time that sets the stage for all lifelong learning. The same is true with mental health. And when you tell people that we have to invest in mental health supports for babies and toddlers, they look at you like you're crazy because they can't comprehend it. It's like, well, how does a baby need mental health services? And what does that even look like for a baby? And the reason this is important is because if you can intervene early with children and provide them the supports that they need, physical, mental, social, they are less likely to need those supports and interventions when they're in the older grades, when it's more expensive and that brain is already kind of set. If you can get it while that brain is still being wired and you help that brain be properly wired, they're going to be set on a much better path. So early childhood mental health, and Lisa is someone who's real expert in this at Head Start with Warren County Community Services, is, she does programming that trains the teachers to how do you interact with kids who may be acting out. They're not acting out because they're bad kids. They're acting out because they have other things, trauma happening in their life, and they don't know how to process it. So this specialty training that her teachers have help them to be able to course correct. And it's super intensive. A lot of these kids that are 12 months old, 18 months old, 24 months old are exhibiting behaviors that I never even imagined a child could exhibit. Things like, excessive chewing of their fingers, their toes, certainly just outbursts, uncontrollable emotions, those sorts of things. And those kids, if you don't get that on a right path, they become kindergartners that now don't have self-control. They become third graders who don't have self-control or executive functioning skills. How do you expect them to learn to read when they don't have self-control? And so while the interventions that are happening in the school right now, they're not really prevention. They are more clinical interventions happening because these kids have complex problems. We need to be more focused or equally as focused on the prevention side to say, we could intervene now and support this child. And also we should support the family of this child because the child is a part of a bigger unit. They cannot live on their own. They need somebody to care for them. And so if the parent is experiencing stress, like they've lost their job, they're about to be evicted, maybe there's domestic violence in their family, that child, the reason why they're acting out is because they are taking on the stress of their parent. So yes, we have to provide this intensive training and opportunity for the child, but we also have to be smart enough to say, and then how can we support this family so that they can get on the right path too? Parents are their child's first and best teacher. Teachers can't, teachers aren't that. Teachers can work with parents as a team and really support one another, especially these kids who have a lot going on in their life, to set them on the right course. And that's really a prevention strategy. Yeah, there's that trauma that's happening in the family that's impacting a child. What we don't want is that trauma to turn into then that older adult or adolescent who now is the primary source of trauma.
Well, I know I've always said I wish that mental health and dental health would be viewed in a similar healthy way.
Yes.
That everyone has a little checkup periodically.
Yeah.
Everyone. You don't wait until you see an outburst. You work with everyone and make everyone feel comfortable talking about, how are you feeling today? More than just, how are you doing today?
Yes.
You dig in a little more, but in an age appropriate, way of discussion. So it sounds like you clearly are working in that area and what you do because you have that similar philosophy. And luckily for us here in Ohio, it does seem that the support is there, the financial
It's
budget
definitely
support.
changing. I still think, we're not where we need to be. Just in parity itself, I mean, there's still a stigma tied to any sort of mental health services. And, we just have to get to the point where a lot of mental health conditions are diseases, just like diabetes or heart disease. There's treatment for it, and we have to make it okay for people to seek those services.
Right.
So it's getting so much better. This may be one of those things that the pandemic, the sort of good things about the pandemic, or at least
The silver lining.
the silver lining, yeah, that I think people are much more aware of why this is an important part of our overall health and wellness.
Well, one thing that I wanted to connect with, when you mentioned about working with the families as well, that kind of leads me to something that apparently I'm reading more. In fact, I mentioned to you in the current ARP edition of the magazine that I get, more and more grandfamilies and grandparents are now raising their grandchildren. And I asked a number of my friends on my Zoom call the other day that we all went to high school together, and I said, do you know people who are grandparents who are raising their grandchildren? And I said, can you imagine taking that on as a I mean, of course you would emotionally want to take it on, but there's a whole world of things that you take on, responsibilities, and is there the support there? And where do grandparents who raise their grandchildren, where do they go to even begin to find out if there's support?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we see that even in Warren County in our children's services system, where unfortunately, due to the scourge of drugs in large part, you have families, parents that become addicted to opiates and can no longer take care of their children. And oftentimes our children's services system wants to find a kinship placement. So somebody they're related to, because it's somebody familiar to the child. Because again, they're trying to limit that trauma exposure. And so oftentimes a grandparent is that person. But it's an incredible burden because these grandparents many times want to do it because they love their children and grandchildren and they want the best for them. But many grandparents are still working and they have to work. And they're making an income that they may not qualify for a child care subsidy for their grandchild, but they can't afford the cost of child care. And so they oftentimes have to say, I can't do this, not because I don't want to, but because I can't afford to do that. And so we have at the county, oftentimes tried to make those accommodations, and because we want to support those families the best we can. But it is part and parcel to the fact that our idea of what family looks like, for me, it was like Ozzie and Harriet. I saw Ozzie and Harriet. I watched it religiously, and that was, my idea of family. And that's what a lot of people's idea of family is. It's what their idea of school is. But our public policy hasn't kept pace with how dramatically families have changed. So certainly more grandparents are becoming guardians to their grandchildren. You have more foster families. You have more adoptive families. Many adoptive families are taking on children who have complex medical needs or behavioral needs. The concept of family has changed so dramatically, not to mention the fact that you have a lot of single parent heads of household. You have a lot of blended families. You have just a lot. When nowadays, when young people, when my kids think of the word family, they're not describing Ozzie and Harriet. They're describing something completely different. So we need public policy to be able to keep up with that, and it hasn't. So it's been haphazard. So through our children's services system, we work really hard trying to provide more supports to our kinship families, and we're constantly advocating to the state and our state legislative delegation to make investments so we can be able to support these families. But it's hard. I really feel for these families.
Well, you are in such a pivotal position, clearly, and I'm happy to see that you are there because I feel like you really have a grasp of all the different facets, including the policy making, which, many people would just say, well, that's over my pay scale, to formulate policy. And yet, when it comes down to working then as a county commissioner, that's where we go when we talk about policy. And maybe you would want to talk about a few things on the horizon as a Warren County. We'll switch hats now and go to Warren County Commissioner, because it's not too many people that I know, and probably most of you know, that are the CEO of a Groundwork Ohio organization, and then also serve as the Warren County Commissioner in whatever county you live in. So tell us what you do with Warren County Commissioner.
I first of all, it is just one of the greatest honors of my life to have the opportunity to serve the citizens of Warren County. I've spent my life in public service. I am just really committed to wanting to make my community the best it can be. I was driven there, when my kids were young, because I understood how important it was for them to be raised through good schools and a good community, to have good jobs, to be able to, why the economy needed to be strong for them. And that work just continues, because we all want to live in the best place, and I kind of feel like Warren County is a pretty great place to live and work, raise a family. And so my two worlds kind of collide in that we are doing a few things at the county that are very specific around some of the issues we've talked about. So we've been working on an early childhood mental health project, a 2-year project where we're working with the mental health experts in the community, assessing what our strengths, weaknesses, opportunities are, so that we can develop the kinds of services that young families here need. So that's really exciting, and that's work to come. We've been investing in some child care pilots to try to develop more in-home child care providers, really make a strong business for someone who wants to open up their home to support the workforce, but at the same time doing it in a way that's supports that child, but also supports the economics of that business itself. And that's where a lot of second, third shift, weekend shift, overnight shift, it's hard enough to get 9 to 5 childcare. It's nearly impossible to get second, third, weekend shift childcare. So we're really trying to develop up some capacity for people. And then, I think cornerstone for us at the commission is really managing our budget in a conservative way, but maintaining the high quality services that people expect from us. So we have a very strong financial footing. We have maintained a AAA bond rating. We have a surplus that we've been able to carry over. Last year, we did a sales tax holiday, or a property tax holiday for residents and businesses in the community. So we are starting with this strong, fiscally conservative foundation, and then recognizing, I think, the places we need to go to invest in alongside of the community, but doing it, with the community. So I'm excited about that. The other thing I would mention is, I meet with lots of people, as you can imagine. And for the last year or so, every time I've been meeting with business leaders in the community, and you ask them what is their challenge to doing business, they all say workforce. We have trouble getting workforce, retaining workforce, recruiting workforce. So why is that? Childcare, affordable housing, and transportation are 3 issues that come up over and over again. And so when I started to ask around, how do we then solve this problem, I quickly realized that it was sort of catch as catch can. Now, there was really good work happening in the community, no question, but sometimes this group didn't know what this group was doing.
Okay.
We didn't know where the sort of opportunities to scale or where the shortfalls were. So Sinclair Community College and the Warren County Educational Services Center and Duke Energy and the Warren County Port, we've sort of come together, and I asked them, can we come together and, invite everyone who's interested in working on workforce through a process to kind of assess where are we, who's doing what, and what are the things that we need to build or do in this county so we have a pipeline of highly trained workforce. And so that work is going on right now. It's super exciting to me as someone that's, I'm not a workforce expert. I guess I'm kind of the convener, if you will, of this, and said, and I wasn't really sure when I started, would people be as excited as I was about this? we've had 80, 90, 100 people participating in small group activity, some focus grouping, interviews, surveying, and we're going to have a report that comes out the beginning of the summer that's going to say, okay, here is the map forward for Warren County. Here's where you have great assets, and we have some great assets. I mentioned some of them already. Sinclair Community College, a great asset. Our Educational Service Center, a great asset. But where are there gaps? And does the ESC know what Sinclair is doing in, some specific area? Do all the school districts know what business leaders really need? So the participation has been really humbling, and I'm excited to present this work to the community because it's really designed by the community. We have a professional facilitator who's walking all of us through this process, but it's really designed by the people who are responsible for wanting to have a vibrant workforce to then fuel this community we live in.
It reminds me of when I chaired the Think Regional programs the last few years, and we specifically focused on workforce in 2017, workforce development. And of course, we were doing it for 15 counties in Southwest Ohio. But it was very enlightening to see how much separateness was happening.
Yeah.
Not by choice, but just they were busy doing their own things. And then when they happened to all be in the same room, and then you started asking questions, and people started saying, oh, well, I do that. Oh, well, we could do that. And we really talked about collaborating. And I'm happy to say that I have seen some of those collaborations evolve over the last few years in a variety of different topics that we covered. And it's very satisfying to see, because even when I worked with a couple of nonprofits where I had the opportunity to go in and talk with business people, and they would say, we're desperate for workers. Good, we just need them to be able to have the time to learn, and so on. And then I'd say, well, have you ever talked to the school district that's located like right across the interstate from you? And they said, well, no. And I said, well, I'm not criticizing. Yeah. I'm just saying they probably wouldn't walk over and just walk in and say, hi, let's talk, or vice versa. But would you be willing to spend a lunch hour, now and then talking with some of the teachers? And that was, I think, exactly the fact that you're getting people together, the key leaders in those different areas that can really make things happen.
Yeah.
So I'm very, even, I shouldn't say even, because I want to work in that the baby boomer generation is the largest demographic now of all demographics. And we talked about this over a series of shows. And there are many of us who are still very willing to volunteer in the community and contribute. And we want to know what's going on, because we still have some good ideas that we think we could offer. So reach out, and we would love to be involved. I mentioned that I was part of lifelong learning at Miami University, and I'm also part of this program through Miami as well, but we do it over Zoom. And every Wednesday, a student who calls me over Zoom, and she said, I'm working with intergenerational program. Uh-huh. And she said, I cannot believe I go back and I tell my other friends in my class, I'm like, this person is over 70 and she's doing all these things, and oh my gosh. And I said, well, you know what? All the people that I know from lifelong learning are just like me. I said they love life, they want to keep learning, and they have...
70's not even old anymore.
And that's just it. I said I was 71, and she was like, no, I said, well, yes, but I said I'm getting ready for my 50th college reunion this summer. But the thing of it is, I want to remind people out there that the baby boom generation, we were, and in fact, one of my classes right now is about growing up in the 50s. And it was an exceptional decade, and why it was exceptional, and they go through all the graphing of how families, were formed then, and different things, just all different things. It doesn't mean it was a perfect era, because then the 60s came along and there was a lot of, there were things happening under the surface, that it turned out that when I went to Miami, I remember President Shriver saying that the 4 years, 69 through 73, were the most disruptive 4 years at Miami that there had been. Well, you look in history and you see what was going on and so on and so forth. And compared to what was going on other places, Miami was, really kind of hanging in there and managing all this change that was happening. And you talk about changing families. You can see it in the successive decades. And to be able to adapt to change, I think, is such a key to successful living in general,
for sure.
Especially today, don't you think?
For sure. And I think we're going to be experiencing, as just a community, I don't just mean Warren County, I just mean, as citizens here, a lot of rapid change that at a pace that we've never yet experienced. So when you think about technology, so there's always been technological advances, and there's a curve by which you have your early adopters and then eventually moves on. Now with this onset of artificial intelligence, it so dramatically will change how we work, how we live, how we think, and it will happen overnight. And, as human beings, we tend to not like change. I mean, you look how long it has taken for any social change. Well, social change is just a reflection of the people who live in the society.
Right.
This is really going to challenge us as community with, a little c, because the rapid change that we're going to experience will just challenge everything that we believe that we know or hold true for our working lives and our recreating lives and our educational lives and our retirement lives. It's like my mind can't even wrap around it. It's like I know it's coming. I don't know how to prepare for it other than to say, take a deep breath and just, know that what used to be will never be again. The other thing is we have a tendency to romanticize the past. So as humans, we look at the past and we have such fond feelings of the good things that happened in the past, and they get an outsized kind of value in our lives, because we forget or we don't hold on to the things that weren't so great about it. I mean, the 60s weren't great for a lot of people. Right. And that's always the case. And so I think we got to really check ourselves that when we look at the good old days, that we have our eyes wide open in that memory and we're saying, yeah, there was some good stuff, but there was also some, not good stuff.
Right.
And we're now heading into this new frontier, so we can't hang on to the past. We have to just, dive straight into the future.
Well, and again, just in closing, I do think that there was silver lining again with what we experienced with the pandemic in terms of technology, because our whole lifelong learning program had to be changed from in-person to online.
Yeah.
Well, then after we were allowed to start meeting online, I said, well, don't do away with that technology, because many of us found that we were able to take many more classes, you know, on WebEx, which is what Miami uses. And also the other day, and I'll leave with this, taking a class that was talking about the 50s, 1950s, and in the introduction, we said, well, one of our students we knew was on a cruise, and so we said, so where are you today? You know, and she said, well, I'm like in the Mediterranean. You know, she had been in the Indian Ocean a week before, then in the Mediterranean. And I was like, you still get the star for coming the farthest, you know. But then another lady is in Italy, and she's connected. So, I mean, look at the things that change has been a really wonderful
Yes.
Type of change. And I'm so delighted that you as a community leader are involved with not just one, but at least two major positions where you have so much influence. And I'm delighted that you were able to create some space in your schedule today, because
happy to.
It's been, I was just thinking the other day, it's probably been in the 1980s when I remember first meeting you. It was at an organizational meeting for the Christmas parade in Springboro. And it was when, anyway. And we were
that
at
baby I was pregnant with is now 19.
Okay, there you go. And I'm a grandma of two. So there you go, first grade, second grade. So, you know, life luckily for us has certainly been good, but that's how long ago. I remember meeting you.
That was some time ago.
Yes.
Still go to the parade, though. I love the Springboro
it's
parade.
A great parade. So with that being said, once again, Shannon, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Today. And I hope that you really took notes today. I tell you that every time we have a show. I hope that you have your pad and pencil out there, because so many interesting things were said today. Or you can just keep watching Feeling Good over and over and over again, because you know you can watch it on Channel 6, Lebanon, City of Lebanon channel. You can watch it on Warren County Community Services website. You can watch it on YouTube, and you can watch it on ICRC channels, depending upon who your cable provider is. And if you're watching us on YouTube, please like us, share us, and subscribe. We hope you had a great day and that you're feeling good. Bye for now.